So even though we just did square roots last week, we're going to do another quick review because I know those are difficult and they're important for Math 1 next year. So you should already have this in your notes, but to review, a square root is the number that when multiplied by itself gives you the number underneath the radical symbol. So just like you see below, the radical symbol is right here. So we say this as the square root of 16 is 4. 4 is the square root because 4 times 4 gives us the 16, the number underneath the radical. 16 is called a perfect square. So perfect squares are just the square of whole numbers. So for example, 4 is a perfect square because we can get that number by multiplying 2 times 2, which is the same thing as 2 squared. 9 is a perfect square because we can get that number by doing 3 times 3, which is 3 squared. 25 is a perfect square because that comes from 5 times 5, or 5 squared. 64 is a perfect square because we get that by doing 8 times 8, or 8 squared. 100 is also a perfect square, 10 times 10. Non-perfect squares is a number that you cannot get by squaring a whole number. So for instance, 10. Yeah, we can get 10 by doing 2 times 5, 2 whole numbers. But again, it's got to be the square, which means you multiply it by itself. There's no whole number that when you multiply it by itself gives us 10. So that is not a perfect square. Perfect squares, again, are only numbers that you get when you multiply a number by itself, like all of these ones up here. Okay, so we want to place the following numbers on the number line. So take a minute, you can pause, copy down this number line. And if you remember from last week, once we do a number line, if we are ordering square roots and radicals, the best thing to do underneath your number line is put your perfect squares. So for instance, under 1, I would put that's the same thing as the square root of 1. For 2, that's the same thing as the square root of 4. Square root of 9. If you do this with your perfect squares, it's going to help you identify where your radicals and square roots go. So pause, take a minute, do your number line, and write your perfect squares underneath. All right, so make sure that your perfect squares are correct on your number line. So our first one that we have is the square root of 7. So the square root of 7 is going to be in between the square root of 4 and 9, maybe slightly closer to 9, which means it's going to be maybe a little closer to 3. It's going to go right about there. So it's going to be a number in between, a decimal in between 2 and 3. Square root of 23 is in between 16 and 25, much closer to 25, which means it's going to be closer to 5 than it is to 4. So the square root of 23 is going to be a decimal, 4 point something, close to 5. The negative square root of 11. So if I have a negative square root, all that is the exact same thing as the positive, just on the negative side of our number line. So the square root of 11 would go in between square root of 9 and 16. So it's going to be in between negative 3 and negative 4. Maybe a little close to negative 3 because it's closer to 9 than 16. So I'm going to put it about there. So we do it the same way as the positives, just on the negative side. Square root of 52 is going to be in between 49, square root of 49, square root of 64. So in between 7 and 8. It's closer to 49 though, so it's going to be closer to 7. 52. Square root of 9, that's a perfect square. That is directly at 3. I've already got that written down. Negative square root of 6, in between the 4 and the 9, so it's in between negative 2 and negative 3. pretty much very close to halfway. I know my numbers are small here. And then my last one, square root of 102. That's going to be right after the square root of 100. So that's going to be 10 right after 10. So maybe 10.1, 10.2. There we go. So number line, write your perfect squares underneath each integer, and then identify where your non-perfect squares go on the number line. Okay, so what is the approximate value of the square root of 34? So if I want the approximate value, I need to have a number line. So you already have used the number line that you already drew. So I just quickly wrote the part that I need, and so I would put my perfect squares underneath to help me order them. So I know if it's not a perfect square, it's not going to be a whole number. So right away, I'm going to cross off A, 17. That would be 34 divided by 2. That's not what a square root is. Okay? It's going to be a decimal. So let's first identify in between what two numbers is the square root of 34. It's going to be in between 35 and 36 because it's in between the square root of 25 and the square root of 36. Now ask ourselves, this 34, is it going to be closer to 5 or closer to 6? It's much closer to 36, so it's going to be somewhere right around here. So right now I look at my answer choices. I can also automatically cross off D because I've already identified that the square root is in between 5 and 6. So now I'm left with 5.3 and 5.8. Well, we said it's going to be closer to 6. And when I look at these two numbers, 5.8 is closer to 6 than 5.3. So C is our correct answer. Okay, now our more challenging problems. What is the sum, keyword, that means I'm going to be adding, of all the integers, so I'm going to be adding whole numbers, between the square root of 60 and the square root of 24. First thing we have to do is make a number line. So first I put my integers. I have all positives. I'm actually going to need to extend my number line. And then the next thing I do is put my perfect squares underneath. So make sure you have this down on your paper as well. Again, pause at any time to make sure you have everything. So once I have my number line, now I need to determine where these are. The square root of 60 is going to be in between 7 and 8 because it's in between the square root of 49 and the square root of 64. It's going to be closer to 8, so I'm just going to put it right about here. The square root of 24 is going to be right before 5 because it's right before the square root of 25. It's going to go right here. Okay, now that I've identified these, I want to know the sum of all the integers between. So I need to think about where I identified these two on the number line. What are the integers? What are the whole numbers in between those square roots? So if I put like this is my starting point and this is my ending point, what whole numbers are in between? I have 5, 6, and 7. 8 is on the outside, it's not in between it. And 4 and all those other numbers are on the outside, it's not in between. So I just need to add 5 plus 6 plus 7. 5 plus 6 is 11 plus 7 is 18. So the sum of all the integers in between those two numbers, those two square roots, is 18. And then a last review. What is the difference? So automatically I'm thinking I'm subtracting this time, not adding, between the closest integer greater than the square root of 6 and the largest integer value less than the square root of 35. So first thing, I'm going to draw my number line and my perfect squares. You can just use your number line that you just had unless you want to create a new one. So now I'm going to identify where they are on the number line. The square root of 6 is going to be in between 2 and 3 because it's in between square root of 4 and square root of 9, almost halfway in between. Label it. Square root of 35, this is a 6, is directly before the square root of 36, so it's going to be right here. Okay, so I know I'm going to be subtracting, so I'm not adding things in the middle. That was last question. Now let's go back and read which numbers I need. I need the integer, the closest integer greater than the square root of 6. So I see that the square root of 6 is in between 2 and 3. Well, which one is bigger? 3. 3 is the greater integer of square root of 6, so that's going to be 3. I'm going to identify that. Then we want the largest integer value less than square root of 35. So square root of 35 is in between 5 and 6. Well, which one is less? 5. And I want the difference, so I just take these two numbers, subtract, and I get a final answer of 2. So these ones are a little harder because you just have to pay attention to figure out when I have my square root, am I looking for the integer that's to the right or to the left, bigger or smaller? So reading is super important with these questions. All right, so make sure you've got everything down. And hopefully this review makes you understand this even better than last week.